Mabuhay. You are listening to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Please note that this story contains details that can be disturbing and upsetting for some people. So please take care of yourself whilst listening. Whenever I hear about politicians, CEOs, or organizations becoming more corrupt the richer and more powerful they get, I sometimes lose faith in humanity. Is it really our human nature to succumb so easily to corruption, to cling on to money and power instead of doing the quote unquote right thing? And in these moments of rumination, I am constantly reminded that no, it is not in all of our human nature to stand and accept corruption or be drunk on power. Some of us stand up and speak up. In modern times, we call these people whistleblowers. And although I have nothing but respect for them, it cannot be denied that what they do come at a great price to themselves. Some lose their jobs, money, reputation, friends, or family, and some even lose their lives. One such whistleblower was Mark Welson Chua, who, despite his young age, already possessed, it would seem, a strong sense of morality and justice, two admirable virtues that unfortunately did not shield him from the powers that sought to uphold corrupt systems. Hi, my name is Christine, host of Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. Every other Friday, I feature Filipino true crime stories that took place in the Philippines. This is our first episode of season 2, and I am delighted to welcome aboard any new listeners, and I want to thank those who have been on this journey with me since season 1. Make sure you listen until the very end of this episode to hear about my podcast recommendation of the week and some additional information about where to find Lagim on social media. Today's episode is about the heroic Mark Welson Chua. The Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC, provides military education and training to college students in the Philippines. In the past, only male college students were allowed to join the ROTC. The purpose of having this training is to prepare students and train them as reservists in case the Philippines ever finds itself in a war and or an invasion or any emergency. Once mobilized, the ROTC students would become part of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, or AFP. The tradition of having an ROTC in college has a long history that goes all the way back to 1912, when the Philippine Constabulary provided military instruction within the University of the Philippines, or UP. By 1935, participating in the ROTC became mandatory at all colleges and universities. This came at a time when soldiers were soon to be needed in the First and Second World Wars. As time went on and as values slowly started to perhaps change or evolve, more and more people started viewing the mandatory ROTC requirement as something rather arbitrary or maybe unnecessary. Some still believe that the ROTC is needed to instill discipline and patriotism in young Filipinos, whilst others feel that patriotism should and can be instilled in several different ways. And some people genuinely still love the idea of having this requirement, but also equally detest the corrupt system that is so deeply ingrained in the ROTC practice in almost every educational institution. Mark Welson Chua, a 19-year-old sophomore mechanical engineering student at the University of Santo Tomas, or UST, was one of these people. He genuinely loved the ROTC and the military kind of life, but also could not stand the corruption that he saw within the ROTC program at UST. His mother would confirm years later that Mark did not want to see the ROTC abolished. Rather, he wanted to see systemic change to eliminate the wrongs he had been able to observe. So, Mark spoke out. Even before Mark came out to speak about the corruption he had witnessed within the ROTC at his university, the university student publication, The Varsitarian, had already received numerous tips and information from cadets about bribery and extortion committed by officers within the ROTC program. In an article published on the 16th of December 1999, the Varsitarian published a special report called In the Line of Fire, which details anomalies and irregularities in the ROTC. I could not find an online copy of the article, but another article from 2001 did detail again similar anomalies and irregularities, this time with Mark Welson Chua's input. In this second article called Struggle Against the System, the Varsitarian disclosed that after their first expose, nothing much happened as no cadet dared to come forward in the open to corroborate the publication's report or to come forward to make a formal complaint against the ROTC officers in charge. However, Mark Welson Chua and another student called Romulo Yumol made the monumental step and filed a complaint with the Department of National Defense, or DND, which was then given attention by the National Capital Region Regional Community Defense Group. From the get-go, one can see that the complaints mainly revolved around financial issues. One issue, for example, that was raised was a questionable fee of 250 pesos on top of the usual 300 pesos ROTC fee. No one seemed to know what the 250 pesos were for, with some officers saying that it was an administration fee and some saying that it was for patches. Students had never received these patches in the end. Chua and Yumul also revealed that cadets were required to buy attendance cards on their first training Sunday, with the cards being priced at 10 to 20 pesos each. On top of that, cadets were also required to pay 10 pesos every time they had to take their preliminary and final exams. The highest ranking ROTC officer within UST, Major Demi Tejares, a name you will be hearing again soon, said that materials for exams were actually for free. He maintained that cadet officers who asked for these unnecessary fees were reprimanded and then ordered to return the money to the cadets. The cadets would later report that they never actually got their money back. Chua and Yumol also added that the officers made the cadets buy ROTC manuals. Some cadets came forward to say that they did not have enough money for the manuals and that all they had was money to pay for their fare going home. One officer apparently became very angry about this and promised that cadets who did not buy the manuals would face consequences. Those who did not buy the manuals were discharged during one training day. Chua also alleged bribery. He revealed that if a student wanted to be exempt from ROTC, they would need to pay officers a standard fee of 1,500 pesos per semester. Sometimes that fee was even higher. Inevitably, some students in more demanding courses such as nursing or engineering took advantage of that bribery culture because they probably felt they needed more time for their studies instead of being in training. Students who were asked to reveal the people they paid within the ROTC program refused to do so for fear of consequences or being asked to join the training after all. Major Tejares, of course, denied all this, but a former cadet officer said that Tejares was well aware of cadet officers asking for bribes from students and even asked for a cut of the payments from his officers. Another issue brought to the attention of the varsitarian was the lack of lectures. Lectures are a vital part of the ROTC training, and yet, during most training days, the cadets reported that they were not given these. To add to the pressure of being a student, there were also grading discrepancies. Students often complained about how the grades given to them by the officers did not match the grades they eventually saw on record at the registrar's office. A further issue that may have caused some added stress to the students was the fact that the officers were easily angered and at least on one occasion resorted to threatening each other with a gun. This clearly endangered the cadets around them and caused them to worry about their own safety and well being whilst being trained by these so called officers. As a result of Chua and Yumol's formal complaint to the Department of Defense, an investigation followed, and by January 16, 2001, Major Tejares, as well as his entire staff, were relieved of duty by Commander Colonel Froilan Maglaya. Captain Rodolfo Batang assumed Tejares' position afterwards. Obviously, the relieved officers did not take this turn of events well. Chua's expose also prompted the Philippine National Police to conduct an investigation, again focusing on Tejares and his staff, specifically Melchor Mallones, Genesis Binagatan, and Jeffrey Binagatan. However, after only a few weeks, both Tejares and his whole staff were reinstated. By February 2001, the Varsitarian published a second article about the systemic corruption within the UST ROTC command and staff. This is the article I've already mentioned just a few minutes ago. After the publication date, it did not look like there was much action taken either by the university or the Department of Defense. We could assume that they may have taken interest without reporting the progress of any internal or external investigations. However, my research did not yield much as to what happened between February 2001 and the 15th of March 2001. However, one thing was clear. Mark was not happy with the reinstatement of Tejares and his staff, and Mark made sure to continue voicing out his concerns about the corruption happening within the UST ROTC department. Now, why is the 15th of March a significant date? This is the day that Mark Welson Chua first went missing or was last seen alive. We now know that around 4 p.m., Mark's father called him on his mobile phone to inquire about some recordable CDs that Mark was supposed to buy for him. Mark's father, Welson Chua, also asked his son what time he thought he was going to be home. Mark said he would be home by 8. At 10 o'clock in the evening, Mark's uncle texted his nephew from a restaurant in Makati where he and Mark's father were dining. Mark's uncle told his nephew to follow them to the restaurant and gave him directions. Mark texted back and said that he was on his way. This was the last known communication from Mark to his family. By 1 o'clock on the 16th of March, Mark's father and his brother, Mark's uncle, started looking for Mark. They decided to head to the UST Roque Ruanio building, which was near the engineering complex, in the hope to find young Mark there. When they failed to see or meet him there, they headed home and started contacting his friends. But what actually happened to Mark? The account of what happened to him is a combination of statements from ROTC cadet officers Franco Suelto, Eliseo Pitargue, and Eduardo Tabrilla. According to Pitargue and Suelto, at 7:30 in the evening on the 15th of March 2001, UST-ROTC officers organized a meeting with their cadets. It seemed that this was just some normal meeting and had nothing necessarily to do with Mark. Some of the officers, including Pitargue, were told that they would later go into the officers' lounge. Suelto announced that he was going to go ahead as he wanted to finish an article for the school paper. He expressed that he wanted to use the computer in the varsitarian's office to type up the rest of his article. However, a few moments later, Suelto changed his mind and decided that he, in fact, wanted to use the computer in the officer's lounge instead. So he headed to the officer's lounge to log on to the communal computer there. It is my understanding that where Suelto was eventually sat to type up his article, there was a door separating him and whoever was in another office within the lounge. This office was the so-called commandant's office. Pitargue would later say that at some point, Mark was called into this office and officers confronted him about his criticisms of the UST ROTC, but also challenged him to go through a hazing ritual in order to qualify as a ROTC officer, something that Mark aspired to greatly and something that the officers knew about Mark as well. The next thing we know is that Suelto noticed how another officer called Michael von Reynard Manangbao and Pitargue entered the commandant's office. Eventually, Suelto became curious as to what was happening there, so he stood up and decided to take a quick peek into the office. Suelto stated that in the office he saw Mark Welson Chua and other fellow officers. Now, it might not be initially understandable why Mark was so willing to attend the commandant's office with the other officers, knowing that he had exposed them and their corrupt department twice in the past 4 months. But to understand his willingness to attend that meeting is to understand Mark's affection for the ROTC and the military life. He had always wanted to be an officer himself, as I already mentioned. As I also mentioned, I believe that Mark believed that he was called into the office as a part of some initiation rite that all wannabe officers had to go through. And I think the officers knew this and took advantage of this perhaps naivete in Mark. Now, from what can be pieced together from Pitargue and Suelto's accounts, it looked like at some point in this conversation and or confrontation with Mark, the officers started tying together Mark's hands and feet using combat shoe laces. Again, the officers who eventually came forward as witnesses later did confirm that Mark was most probably still under the impression that whatever the officers were doing to him was just part of this hazing. Now, hazing in the Philippines remains a very touchy and controversial subject, especially in Filipino universities, specifically in fraternity and ROTC circles. Hazing activities can range from prank-like silliness to life-threatening injury sustained from being hit repeatedly by objects such as a wooden paddle, perhaps. But Mark most probably took this into stride and was ready to be relieved and released at some point. However, this never happened. From witness accounts, it looked like Mark's head was then wrapped with duct tape. Pitargue would later say that Mark was struggling to breathe after most of his head was wrapped in tape. Mark's body was then dragged out of the office where Suelto was still working on the computer. Suelto said that it was Arnulfo Apari, another officer, who dragged Mark's body out of the commandant's office. Mark was still wearing his UST engineering uniform, and this indicated to Suelto that it was indeed Mark who was being dragged out by his fellow officers. What I found chilling at this point was that Suelto seemed to not have been alarmed about what he just saw. He continued to do whatever he was doing on the computer. Later on, he would say that another officer called Paul Joseph Tan and Eduardo Tabrilla arrived with a brown carpet. The carpet was spread on the floor, and with Manangbao's help, Tan and Tabrilla placed Mark's body lengthwise onto the carpet. They rolled it up and then started to plan on how to sneak Mark's body out of the campus, knowing full well that what they were about to do would certainly attract, at best, confused stares and, at worst, questions from the security guards. So, their plan was to load Mark's body onto a white pickup truck and sneak through security. One of them needed to divert the guards' attention so that the pickup truck could drive through without getting noticed. The plan worked. What I had always wondered about this case was whether Mark was still alive at this point. Suelto's account indicated that Mark was already dead by the time the group left the officers' lounge. Tabrilla, on the other hand, said something wholly different. According to him, whilst the group was hastily planning on how to get rid of Mark, they decided to drive to Las Piñas, to a house rented by Paul Tan. Tabrilla insisted that at this point, Mark was still very much alive, but at this point as well, he did not believe that what was being done to him was part of a hazing ritual. According to Tabrilla, Mark started screaming and pleading for help, but to no avail. The group was way too busy planning on how to finally kill Mark, according to Tabrilla. Tabrilla stated that the officers started arguing amongst each other. Would it be better to shoot Mark? No, that would be too noisy and would attract attention, specifically police attention. After some time, it was decided to suffocate him. It is not clear here whether Mark overheard all of this or whether this discussion happened somewhere else in the rented house, but what I find awful is the thought that it was entirely possible that the group could have been perfectly fine discussing the details of how to kill Mark in front of Mark. I almost feel the helplessness he must have felt, knowing that his life could possibly end right then and there, and that there was absolutely nothing he could do. After all, he was alone and incapacitated against this group of officers who clearly needed to exact their revenge on him. He probably did not think that his well meaning criticisms of a corrupt system that he wanted to change would eventually cost him his own young life. According to Tabrilla, Mark continued to shout, scream, and plead for his life until the first layer of duct tape came off his head and face. The group quickly decided that this was their sign to finally execute what they had just decided. The officers then stuffed something in Mark's mouth. It is not clear what this object was. The officers then wrapped Mark's whole head with duct tape, covering his mouth and nose. According to Tabrilla, Mark slowly suffocated, and the young engineering student died. The group checked on Mark and wanted to make sure that he was definitely not breathing anymore. When they decided that this was the case, Arnulfo Apari took Mark's mobile phone and called his parents, telling them that their son had been kidnapped and was being held for ransom. This seemed like a cruel and morbid thing to do to Mark's parents, who at this point had already been word sick about their son's absence. Mark's parents confirmed later on that Mark was still communicating with them through texts, presumably before Mark walked into the commandant's office that evening. According to Mark's mother, both her and her husband and Mark's uncle thought that maybe Mark had just run out of phone credit when he suddenly stopped responding to them. So when Apari's call came in, they must have been at least relieved to know that their son was alive despite the precarious situation they believed he found himself in. Little did they know, their 19-year-old son had just passed away. Eduardo Tabrilla confirmed that Mark's body was left on the property of Paul Joseph Tan that evening. I reckon the group was not really sure what to do after they had so mercilessly killed Mark that night. Suelto, who was not part of the group at Tan's rented house, went back to the officers' lounge the very next day, the 17th of March. He wanted to continue working on another article. Later on, Manangbao, Tabrilla, and Tan invited him for dinner. Suelto confirmed that whilst dining at a restaurant in Parañaque City, the group did not dare talk about the killing. Suelto then stated that their group proceeded to Tan's rented house afterwards in Las Piñas. Having arrived at the house, the group finally revealed to Suelto how they were now having to dispose of Mark's body. It seemed from his account that despite the lack of a fixed and well thought out plan, the group decided to load Mark's body onto the same white pickup truck that was used to transport Mark from the UST campus to Tan's rented house just less than 48 hours ago. The group then drove around and thought that the best thing to do was to throw Mark's body somewhere dark to properly cover up their heinous crime. Finally, the group decided to head for the Jones Bridge near Lawton, where Manangbao, who was driving the truck, maneuvered the pickup near the riverside and eventually parked. Manangbao, Tan, and Tabrilla carried out Mark's body from the back of the pickup and threw him out into the Pasig River. Suelto also noted that before they left the riverside, Tan warned everyone that no one should know about this crime. And just like that, the group thought they had successfully exacted their revenge and extinguished the life of a young and promising man. In a sense, they had done just that, but they could not predict the waves that were created in taking Mark's life. On the 18th of March 2001, Mark's body was found floating in the Pasig River, and bystanders were quick to call the police, who responded and saw a badly battered body. The police reckoned that Mark, who was still unknown to them at that point, had gone through a lot. They immediately transported his body to a nearby funeral home for initial examination. The medical examiner concluded that Mark died of asphyxiation. Now, I have to take a bit of a detour at this point. In the Wikipedia page, and I know that people look down on Wikipedia, but when research sources are scarce, a Wikipedia page can be a great jumping board for further research. The only reason I was interested in this particular Wikipedia page was because of this detail. The page's author wrote that the medical examiner found sludge in Mark's lungs, indicating that Mark must have been alive when he was thrown into the river and therefore died of drowning. When I went to click on the links to the articles that were referenced for that statement, I realized that the links were either broken or did not contain the information it was supposed to. So there was no way for me to confirm this information through those sources. I tried to find other sources that could confirm this, but I came up empty. What I can confirm, however, was that the autopsy further showed that as the first responders at Pasig River observed, Mark's body was battered, indicating to the medical examiner that Mark most probably went through severe hazing where he sustained blunt force trauma to his body. It is interesting that these details were not included in any of the witnesses' testimonies. Now, whilst the medical examiner continued his work for the next couple of days after Mark was found, Mark was still officially a John Doe. He could not be identified just yet. By the 20th of March, Mark's parents reported the so called kidnappers who called them about holding Mark for ransom. Mark's parents made sure to directly report their missing son to the Presidential Anti Organized Task Force. Within a few hours of reporting their missing son, the medical examiner identified Mark when he found a dog tag on him that contained his complete name. The police had now the difficult task of informing Mark's parents about their son and asking them to formally identify Mark. Both Mark's father and mother confirmed that the body at the funeral home was Mark through his clothing and the same dog tag that assisted the medical examiner earlier. I always imagined the pain of losing a child to be a very different kind of pain, something that no one would even wish on their most hated enemies, and yet people go through it daily in our world. I can imagine parents racking their brain, trying to make sense of the violence, the loss, and the grief. In a YouTube video by Crime Classic, Mark's mother said that as parents, they immediately thought back to the complaint that Mark put in with the Defense Department and the exposés that the Varsitarian published with Mark's input as soon as they received the devastating news of his death. Mark's mother specifically remembered a conversation with Mark weeks before his death. Mark revealed that he had been receiving death threats, which quite naturally worried his parents. From the video, it seems implied that Mark was ready to take these threats into stride, saying that if this was the price he had to pay, then so be it. His mother asked if his cause was worth it, presumably referring to the stress of having such threats, or maybe referring to his life being in danger specifically. And so far, from what we know of Mark, he seemed like a very principled person who genuinely believed that with his efforts, he could potentially change a corrupt system, something that would greatly benefit students like him and students that would come after him. Now, it has to be noted that Mark's parents were very dissatisfied with the first autopsy and requested the National Bureau of Investigation for a second autopsy. This was done, but I could not find any article that documented the results of this autopsy. From what I understand, the autopsy must have happened immediately after the first one because Mark was buried in Cavite by the 25th of March, merely 4 days after his parents requested the second autopsy on March 21st. Between those two dates, it seems that the police investigators worked continuously and concluded, rather prematurely in my opinion, that Mark had in fact not died in a kidnap for ransom scheme. Sure, they have the input of Mark's friends and family who clearly believed that Mark's advocacy about the corruption in the UST ROTC department was a major factor in his demise, but what else did the police have at that point, really? Anyway, by the 17th of April, an intelligence report penned by the Armed Forces of the Philippines detailed that Mark's killers were the ones who also abducted him. This report was the first intelligence to discern from the situation that Mark's abductors meant to kill him, and they merely made it appear like they abducted Mark for ransom. So far, this report was on track with what Petarge, Suelto, and Tabrilla would later say, as we have already heard earlier. Mark's death was not only making headlines due to its heinous nature at this point. Filipinos were beginning to question not only how universities dealt with their ROTC departments, but how the ROTC dealt with students. Inevitably, then President Macapagal Arroyo had to comment. She ordered the local authorities to deal with the investigation expediently, and even ordered the Department of Interior and local government to extend its help to the investigators. So, in order to optimize their investigation, officials of the National Bureau of Investigation, the Philippine National Police, and the University of Santo Tomas combined resources and efforts. By the 25th of April 2001, two witnesses came forward and claimed that they saw four men dump Mark's body into the Pasig River. The witnesses, Rico Hernandez Nicolan and Jeffrey Lucena, identified Genesis Binagatan and Jeffrey Binagatan in their sworn statements. Both Binagatans, as you may remember, were also ROTC officers and staff members of Major Demi Tejares. Following this lead, police officers of the Western Police District, or WPD, arrested the Binagatan brothers. Suspicion also fell on Major Tejares, who was also eventually arrested and charged with killing Mark. However, Tejares and his staff were eventually released, and the charges against them were dropped due to insufficient evidence. 5 days later, on the 30th of April, AFP Chief of Staff General Domedio Villanueva and Department of Education, Culture, and Sports Secretary Raul S. Rocco announced that they will work towards the immediate abolition of the ROTC. Rocco proposed that the ROTC should be eliminated in the college and university curriculum. This was the start of an almost avalanche movement to essentially abolish and disown a practice that has been in existence for almost as long as Filipino independence from Spain. I will talk more about the domino effect of Mark's death on the ROTC later, because it makes much more sense to outline this after we talked about what happened to Mark's case. So, let's go back to the investigation. With the release of the Binagatan brothers and Tejares, the police had their work cut out for them, and they continued to look for leads, or at the very least gather evidence on the grounds of the suspicions expressed by Mark's parents against the UST ROTC department. In a surprising turn of events, an anonymous ROTC official contacted Mark's father and shared details of the crime and identities of his son's killers to him around October 2001. Weirdly enough, this anonymous caller, who claimed to be someone who quit being an ROTC officer, insisted that neither Tejares nor the Binagatans were involved in Mark's death. This is an odd detail that I will come back to later on. The anonymous caller pointed his fingers at Arnulfo Apari, Michael von Reynard Manangbao, Paul Joseph Tan, Eduardo Tabrilla, Francisco or Franco Suelto, and Jeremy Dunuan. The police moved quickly to search for their new set of suspects, whilst the prosecution made sure to initiate new proceedings against these 6 men. By the 8th of November 2001, a new witness came forward to the Department of Justice. The witness stated that he was a fine arts student and also a ROTC officer from December 2000 until March 2001. He stated in an affidavit that he believed that some officials and officers of the UST ROTC could be behind Mark's killing. He disclosed that he saw Mark at the department's office on the night Mark was first believed to have gone missing. This witness also saw someone with tied hands and feet and with their head wrapped up with duct tape within the ROTC officer's lounge later on. This was most probably Mark, according to the witness. The police most probably at this point determined that with all of the leads so far, their efforts would be much better invested focusing on the names given by the anonymous caller and by the lead provided by the fine arts student. So, after a few months of searching, the police were getting ready to make their first arrests. My understanding is that Dunuan and Suelto were the first ones who were arrested either late 2001 or early 2002. Both men quickly expressed to the police and the prosecution that they were willing to testify against the others and therefore turn into state witnesses. Other individuals who were considered minor players were also apprehended one by one. These were Patrick Christopher Cruz, Eliseo Petargi Jr., and Emmanuel Rico Corpus. However, quickly after they were arrested, the three men were released due to, again, insufficient evidence against them. It was at this point as well when rumors have spread that one of the suspects at large, Michael von Reynard Manangbao, was hiding in the United States. It is unclear whether any extradition efforts were initiated to address this issue, but the PNP did express that they had the intention to petition the US for Manangbao's extradition. But at no point did I find any document that can show that this was actually done. So I'm assuming that they have not done this. Now, by February 2002, something interesting happened. Arnulfo Apari willingly surrendered to the police authorities. Unfortunately, Tabrilla as well as Stan and Manangbao were still at large at this point. Not long after Apari's arrest, criminal proceedings against him were initiated. Now, I wish I had found a court document or documents that would properly outline the prosecution and the defense's theory of the case, aka their versions of the event, but alas, I did not find any court documents at all. So instead, I tried to piece together information from articles by national newspapers and also UST's own The Varsitarian. From what I could piece together from these articles, it looked like the prosecution straightforwardly stated their case and depended on the accounts of Suelto, Petarge, and Dunuan, as well as the other witness accounts they have received over the course of their investigation. The defense's main strategy was to say that Mark most definitely died from ROTC hazing actions, presumably eliminating the element of premeditation for murder, which I think is towing a line here. Look, I am not and was never a criminal lawyer, but knowing the little criminal law from law school, I think the defense did not start strongly here, in my opinion. All I could think about when I was reading this was they were probably going for making sure that they can prove that there was an absence of premeditation and planning as to the murder, but not as to the bodily injury. I'm only speculating here, but they must have thought, hey, so yes, hazing takes place in all universities, and sometimes it can get out of hand, but these kids do not set out to kill each other. It is all just little fun and games, and yes, sometimes they do get hurt, but that is never the intention. Like I said, it's towing the line here, but who am I to speak? I'm not a criminal lawyer. I just wished I knew what their strategy was in all this. Apari's defense lawyer also insisted that his client was actually innocent and this was the reason he willingly surrendered to the police. But the trial court remained unconvinced. In March 2004, Judge Romulo Lopez of Regional Trial Court Branch 18 found Apari guilty and sentenced him to death. Judge Lopez also ordered Apari to pay Mark's heirs 50,000 pesos. The judge also noted that Mark's parents did not seek civil damages. As in all criminal cases of this kind, the conviction was automatically elevated to the Supreme Court for review. In the meantime, Apari was held in custody and sent to the National Bilibid prisons. In his decision, Judge Lopez said, "The court found that the perpetrators have enjoyed and delighted in making Mark suffer slowly and gradually, causing him unnecessary physical pain." The judge continued, and I quote, "The perpetrators' actuations denote sadism and marked degree of malice and perversity. Chua's inhuman death was augmented by the use of other process of sufferings for the assailant's satisfaction." End of quote. The judge also took the time to comment on the suspects that were still at large. The charges against Tan, Tabrilla, and Manangbao were archived and said to be brought back to the court's calendar as soon as they were apprehended. At this point, rumors about the three were all over the place. Suddenly, Manangbao was said to have never left the country at all and was spotted, in fact, in Cubao. Tan was believed to be staying with relatives in Lamitan, Basilan in Mindanao, whilst Tabrilla was believed to be hiding in Manila. Just to add here that both Dunuan and Suelto were in the end acquitted. Mark's father, who was the family's spokesperson, found that the sentence was too harsh for someone who he believed was the least culpable. The family remained convinced back in 2004 that Manangbao was the mastermind of the killing. Somehow, I can see where Mark's father was coming from with regards to the harshness of Apari's sentence. Although it was made clear by some of the witnesses that Apari was at the crime scene, helped wrap Mark's body in the carpet, and was on Jones Bridge when the group disposed of Mark's body, it probably looked to Mark's father like Apari was made an example of, treating him as if he embodied all the other suspects. I can only speculate, of course. Maybe the judge thought that he would not consider degrees of culpability or mitigating circumstances in this case and would simply sentence all suspects with the death penalty, seeing as he already made up his mind about the group given what he said in his decision. Mark's father also expressed frustration at the University of Santo Tomas itself. He urged the university to look into their campus security and to better honor his son, who, according to him, took the ultimate risk to expose corruption that the university should have dealt with in the first place. Needless to say, Welson's friends and family did not feel like this was complete justice, and rightfully so. With suspects still at large and with the university getting away almost unscathed from this issue, Mark's family felt that only partial justice was achieved. Our story now needs to fast forward to 2006, where seemingly a lot of things have happened. Firstly, Apari's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment as capital punishment was abolished in that very same year. In the same year, Eduardo Tabrilla was finally apprehended in Cavite after eluding authorities for close to 5 years. He was offered a plea bargain which would see his charges downgraded from murder to homicide. Of course, he took it. Not only would this mean a shorter custodial sentence, but a chance to avoid a long trial. In the Crime Classic video, which I highly recommend despite its shortcut type of narration of facts, Tabrilla himself was interviewed. He struck me as a man who had come to terms with his crimes, someone who has taken and is taking accountability and is very open about what happened. I could hear, or at least wanted to hear, a tinge of remorse in his voice, especially when he said in the interview that Mark's father approached him after his arraignment. Welson Chua, a father who fought tirelessly for his son and his memory, expressed forgiveness towards Tabrilla and then hugged him. This was something that Mark's mother could not initially understand, but I guess as human beings, we all react differently to people who deeply hurt us, and we also express forgiveness differently from each other. It looks like in 2006, one of the witnesses from earlier, Rico Nicolan, retracted his testimony. It is not clear whether this happened before or after Tabrilla's sentencing. In essence, Nicolan claimed that he was instructed by agents within the NBI Special Action Unit to point to Genesis Binagatan as one of the men he and another witness, Jeffrey Lucena, saw dumping a wrapped object with the shape and size of a man into the Pasig River. The same agents also coached him, apparently, to implicate the other Binagatan brother, Jeffrey. Nicolan also claimed that he was paid 1,000 pesos by Mark's mother when he was in custody of the WPD, or Western Police District. He apparently also received an additional 500 pesos after he pointed to Genesis Binagatan as being behind Mark's killing. Nicolan was previously held in custody by the NBI, but after his retraction, it seems that Nicolan just faded into oblivion and was never heard of again. Lastly, and sadly, in 2006, Mark's father passed away, not really seeing complete justice after all. This news added an extra layer of sadness to the case, which technically is still open, seeing as Tan and Manangbao are still, to this day, at large. In his last interview with the Varsitarian before his death, he wished that Tabrilla would tell him the whole story of what happened to his son so that he may get closure. Tabrilla obliged to this wish and wrote a statement detailing what happened to Mark. This statement has never been shared with the public nor with the police, and it is my understanding that Mark's mother has kept this written statement in her possession. Only time will tell if she'd be willing to disclose it to the public once the other suspects are apprehended, perhaps. On another note, Mark's mother, from what I could gather in the Crime Classic interview, never truly believed that these young officers were the only ones culpable. She believed that such young men could not have come up with the cruel idea of killing Mark without any input from someone higher up in the hierarchy of officers, implying that maybe Tejares and the Binagatans may really have had a hand in killing Mark. Unfortunately, the investigation, it seems to me, never really went that deep. I realized that having Tabrilla's statement in her possession, she could have easily implicated more senior officers if Tabrilla had indeed pointed his fingers at his superiors, such as Tejares or the Binagatans. Seeing as she never came forward about this, it can be deduced that Tabrilla's statement never implicated anyone else than himself and the other students who we have already heard being mentioned in this episode. So, what was Mark Welson Chua's legacy in the end? It is hard to talk about legacy when it was known that Mark did not necessarily want to see the ROTC abolished. His mother reiterated in the Crime Classic video that he loved the ROTC. He just wanted to see it changed. But it looks to me like certain people, and most specifically politicians, had jumped at the opportunity to capitalize on what happened to Mark, seeing that there was a growing anti ROTC sentiment, especially amongst college students who would soon be first time voters. Just to remind you, by April 2001, a mere 6 weeks after Mark's death, the Armed Forces of the Philippines and Department of Education, Culture, and Sports vowed to work for the immediate abolition of the ROTC. A total of 17 bills and resolutions were put forward by both houses, and many of these bills did not fail to mention Mark in their texts. Not long after, Congress passed Republic Act 9163, or the National Service Training Act, in which ROTC was made non compulsory. College students were given the option to take up literacy training service or civic welfare training service instead of the ROTC. Furthermore, the NSTP was supposed to provide for the creation of a National Service Reserve Corps, or NSRC. This would be composed of the graduates of the non ROTC components. Members of the Corps may be tapped for literacy and civic welfare activities through the joint effort of the Department of National Defense, the Commission on Higher Education, and the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority. Sadly, this plan only existed on paper for 8 years or so. Nothing really came of it until around 2010. Furthermore, despite the ROTC being merely an option and nothing mandatory by 2002, students nationwide did not really see much of a difference in the systems that held up the ROTC culture. Cases of hazing that ended in death, for example, amount to about 30 since Mark's death. We have all heard about the death of Horatio Castillo III, who ironically was a freshman law student at UST and who died in 2017. National Union of Students of the Philippines spokesperson in 2017, Mark Vincent Lim, argued that the ROTC and their practices had, and I quote, continuously violated the democratic and academic rights of Filipino students, end of quote. However, this issue was, I think, overshadowed by a new group of ROTC proponents who grew louder and bolder when the new administration was voted in. There was a shift of some kind that by no means only took place when Duterte was voted in. Several Congress and Senate members proposed bills to make ROTC mandatory again as early as 2006, all through the latter years of the Noynoy Aquino administration. The basis of a lot of the pro-mandatory ROTC arguments can be boiled down to this. Because the NSRC was de facto a failure, and because the ROTC is now not mandatory anymore, enrollment into the program has been dropping significantly for the last decade or so. Proponents of the ROTC saw this as something to be worried about because this would mean that the country would have now less reserve army forces compared to the years when the ROTC was a compulsory part of the college curriculum. Proponents of the ROTC maintained that the NSRC program had not really been implemented until 2010, with the University of the Philippines, for example, not even formally creating a NSTP office until June 2013. The Commission on Higher Education, or CHED, had not gotten around to issuing the guidelines for issuing serial numbers to the graduates of the non-military component of the NSTP until August 2015. I think the biggest argument put forward by the pro-ROTC camp was the lack of NSRC personnel during Typhoon Yolanda. There was simply no people pool to draw manpower from. As for the politicians, they also made their positions gradually known. In 2017, House National Defense and Security Committee Chair Representative Rafi Biazon said that making the ROTC voluntary was a knee jerk reaction to Mark's death. In his mind, Mark's death was not enough of a reason to remove the ROTC as a mandatory requirement in college. He said, and I quote, to say that there is corruption in ROTC, so we have to ban it, but there is also corruption in academic subjects. Why can't we ban it? Of course, we cannot do that. That's the purpose of education. End of quote. So, being the ROTC proponent that he was at that point and probably still is, he proposed a bill. Now, you would think he would have provisions in that bill that would address the exact issues that Mark pointed out and lost his life for, but this congressman did not, which was a head scratcher for me, to be honest. He said his bill does not have any safeguards against abuses in the ROTC program. He also said that the amended anti hazing law, which imposed heftier penalties for hazing, would be enough to protect cadets. The same problem arose in Pacquiao and Soto's bill. There was strong talk about reinstating the ROTC as a mandatory requirement, but nowhere in the bill did they provide for mechanisms to make sure that officers, both of the ROTC and the AFP within a university's ROTC program, can be held accountable when they do something wrong. At some point, and inevitably, President Duterte chimed in and brought forward an argument that has become common amongst proponents of mandatory ROTC. That argument is patriotism. It is the belief of the president and other like minded people that being trained in the ROTC instills patriotism, and ridding our country of the ROTC would mean allowing patriotism to be eroded, especially within the younger generations. Opponents of the mandatory ROTC have, of course, a different take. Akbayan Party List Representative Tom Villarin had warned that the ROTC may be used to ultimately suppress dissent. He said, and I quote, the state of national emergency still being imposed nationwide can be used as a pretext to mobilize the ROTC to suppress legitimate dissent and go against citizens critical of the Duterte administration. End of quote. He also added that the proposal to make ROTC mandatory again is, and I quote again, an empty act of patriotism when our leaders are surrendering our sovereignty to foreign powers. End of quote. By 2019, a bill making the ROTC mandatory again, but this time for the 11th and 12th graders, has passed its final reading. The president showed his support of this bill by certifying it as urgent. The latest update I have is that on the 21st of May 2019, the lower house passed their version of the proposed law. So, having said all that, one has to ask at this point, what is Mark's legacy? Whilst I can imagine him probably being happy that the ROTC will be reinstated soon, I cannot help but think that he would be disappointed to see that no one bothered to really dig deep into the issues he had raised. He wanted to make things better, and the politicians who rode on the pro-ROTC bandwagon over the years will have had their ulterior motives for proposing bills to reinstate the program, but why not address the corruption? The thing with history is that it is bound to repeat itself if we keep doing the same thing. We simply cannot expect different results from the current iteration of the ROTC if the systemic rot is not addressed. students will continue to fall victim to extortion, exploitation, intimidation, and hazing. No amount of posthumous awards given to Mark can really remedy that. The best way to honor him as a hero is to really address the problems he saw as someone who was inside the program and who had seen and felt the vulnerability of fellow students. That is the only way to honor him and to hold up his legacy. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to Season 2's first episode. This case has sat on my mind for a very long time since it was first suggested to me by a listener, and I hope you were able to learn a lot from Mark's story. And now to my podcast recommendation of the week. My podcast recommendation of the week is the Gleeful Talk Show podcast by the ever so wonderful and charming Glee, a Filipino expat in Australia. Here is her trailer.
Glee, exultant, high spirited joy. What does it mean to lead a gleeful life? Hi, my name is Glee, and you're listening to the Gleeful Talk Show, where we share zesty stories to cultivate the happiness and hero within. Listen to zesty stories and conversations with everyday people and experts alike from all parts of the world. Episodes are out weekly, where you will learn to develop a healthy mindset, inspired to pursue your goals, or understand yourself or relationships better. Join the Zesty community on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. The show is available on all major podcasting platforms, or visit us at www.gleefultalkshow.com. Thanks for listening.
Lagim fam, as always, make sure to follow Lagim on all its socials. We are on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook, and even YouTube. Just search for Lagim Podcast on Facebook and YouTube. On Facebook, we have a fan page and a discussion group, so make sure to follow and join us there. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to like and comment on all the videos that we have up there. Lastly, please do not forget to follow Lagim on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and to rate and review Lagim on Apple Podcasts as well. It really helps the podcast become more visible to other listeners. Again, thank you so much for all your support. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.